Hello all, how are we?
We're great, thank you.
Hi,
Tim,
Tim.
how are you?
Oh, I'm loving the background.
I'll send you one.
Yeah, please do.
Tim, you should know we're very corporate in Auckland, mate, especially in lockdown.
I guess when you don't have offices to work out of.
Yeah. Apparently, we've still got offices somewhere in the city, so we'll get back there whenever.
Shudder to think what state they might be in if you left anything out.
Yeah, it's what's in the fridge. Mr. Bailey, how are you?
I'm well.
Yeah. Living the life?
Always.
We'll just give it a couple of minutes, everyone, just while we admit some more people into the room. I think we've got over 30 at the moment, which is good for being on time. It's almost Germanic precision, so well done. Afternoon, Ewan. How's life at ABB?
Afternoon, Dean. Yeah, good, thanks. I hope you're well.
Very well, thank you. And Basil, nice to see you from ICA. Great. And Paul Ricketts, nice to see you, mate. JLR representing.
Likewise, Dean.
Okay, give it another minute and then we'll kick off. How's that count, Hannah?
There's no one else waiting at the moment, so I think we're probably good to commence if you'd like to.
Great. Well, let's do that. Let's commence, everyone. Well, kia ora, katoa katoa, and welcome everyone to Drive Electric's webinar. On behalf of Mark Gilbert, our chairman, and the rest of the Drive Electric board, welcome to today's session. For those of you that I haven't met personally, my name's Dean Sheed. I'm a board member of Drive Electric, and my day job is looking after Audi here in New Zealand. Now, most of you will be aware that Drive Electric is a not-for-profit. We're focused on a single key activity, which is the mainstreaming of electric mobility in this country as part of our direction to decarbonise transport. Our membership's diverse, and if you just looked at the attendees that are attending today, it's a very good reflection of our membership base and the people who are connected to this decarbonising journey that we're all on. We have representatives from the vehicle OEMs. We have team members from the used car industry. We have finance and insurance representatives. We have the fleet and leasing organisations represented. We have people from the infrastructure and charging communities. We have the electricity generators and retailers, and of course the government represented by ICA today. So welcome and thank you for attending today. Now 2021 is going to go down as a year of many activities and many things, but from a Drive Electric perspective, it's been incredibly busy, particularly on the policy and strategy area. Earlier this month, you may be aware that we presented our findings to the Select Committee on the new government's Clean Car Bill, and we were very pleased to be part of that process and first cab off the rank there, as we say. But as always, there's more work to do. And we believe one of those activities and one of those actions that we still need to focus on is understanding more about the Australian market, their opportunities, their threats, with decarbonising and the road to EV adoption. And the reason for that is many of you either have your head offices based there or you have business partners who either work or are based there. And I firmly believe the more we understand their market and where their mindset's at and what they perceive to be the opportunities and threats, the better we will be, and then we can use that as better leverage to get the right outcomes that our organisations and you as members are looking for. So we need to look across the Tasman, look across the ditch, find out what's going well, what's not, and then use that potentially to our advantage and get some good conversations going. Now, if that's the outcome, the action we're taking today is we have a wonderful guest presenter today. Beard Jafari is the Chief Executive Officer of the Electric Vehicle Council in Australia, and it's very nice to have him here today. He works with industry, so he has a member organisation of about 60 members, very, very similar to our makeup. He works with that industry, he works with the government and the media to accelerate the adoption of EVs, very similar to our aims and our goals. And he says in his bio that it's all towards a more sustainable and prosperous Australia, and I can understand that as well. We will have a short presentation from him, and then we have a range of questions which you have submitted. We'll also, if time allows, use the chat function as well, and we'll take some direct questions once again if time permits. But just the normal housekeeping rules. I see most of you have your microphones on silent. Thank you for that. And without further ado, I'll hand across to Beard. Welcome.
Thanks a lot for that, and thanks everyone for spending some time to come and listen to me talk. So as mentioned, the Electric Vehicle Council, we run as an industry association here in Australia, very similarly Drive Electric. We have members right across the value chain, very much focused on the opportunities and benefits that electric vehicles bring to our country. So everything from electricity generation, clean electricity generation, where we may, infrastructure build-outs, manufacturing opportunities. So much of our work in Australia is very focused on how we can accelerate the market for electric vehicles, even though it is the industry development portion that we're after, for the very obvious reason that it's very hard to have an industry without a market to serve. So a lot of what I'm going to be talking to you a bit about today is how that market is developing out. But people who have questions around what doing business is like here and what, who different industry players are, please feel free to throw those into questions. And speaking of questions, my aim with these things always is to try to get through my speaking at you all portion as quickly as possible so that I get to have a discussion with everyone. So if you do have questions for me or things that you'd like to share, please have those ready to go. I'm just going to share my screen very quickly here, and I'm going to assume that this is working. Please tell me if it's not.
Looks good.
Wonderful. So going over a few of these points quickly, what you may know about the Australian market already is that we're, of course, behind the rest of the world when it comes to electric vehicle adoption, and even behind New Zealand when it comes to electric vehicle adoption, and certainly far behind New Zealand when it comes to policy in order to help spur that change from laggard to leader in this space. But what I'd like to spend a bit of time pointing at today is what gives us quite a good bit of hope, both from the policy landscape, what's happening in the markets, and product availability for consumers. So I'll need to couch all of this, and I'd like to couch all of this in showing where it is that we're starting off from. You can see over in that far right-hand corner that Australia is sort of building off of less than 1% of new vehicle sales being electric, finally tipping over that today. So everything that I talk about in growth, remember, quite a lot of work still ahead of us. We're very excited and enthusiastic, but in a very realistic way. Some of the points that we're going to be touching on is really looking at, while over past years we have been concerned about how sluggish the market has been, what we've started to see throughout the end of last year and throughout this year is a market where electric vehicle sales are now more than doubling. In fact, we expect something more like 2.5% increase from the previous year. We've seen the number of models being made available to consumers already increased by 50% from 12 months ago, and the number of charging stations, public fast charging stations being built, increased by 25%. And on that last one, the pipeline of investment that's already been earmarked, whether from private or public sources, shows that, in fact, the number of charging stations over the next potentially now 18 to 24 months, as COVID drags out some build times or product availability times, the charging station deployment is increasing by about 400% over this next period. So quite a big rush coming to us within the market. But so let's start at the beginning of market share. You can see here quite clearly, this really well illustrates that issue for us of we're now looking at around 1.6 to 1.7% of new vehicles being sold being both battery electric and plug-in hybrid is what we've included into those numbers. Something like 75% of them are battery electrics, to the rest being plug-in hybrid vehicles, for those of you wondering. And really for us in the work that we do, particularly with policymakers, is pegging ourselves to markets, for instance, like the UK or California, and saying how can we help reach what we would say a average leading nation, if not a great leading nation like Norway can achieve. I think that we'll call that the stage 2 of our plan. For us, it's looking at how can we, in a very short period of time, be reaching more like 10 to 15% market share of electric vehicles. Moving on, it's some of the areas that's giving us, that we're seeing a lot of support coming in through, and it causing some of these boosts to investment in things like charging infrastructure, model availability, which all leads to higher sales, is while we've had, and if you read our news from time to time, you'll see the biggest pain point for us is the lack of federal direction on electric vehicles. We've now finally passed a hurdle where state governments and other subnational governments are the ones really starting to lead the charge and recognising that frustration at the lack of federal activity has been there for quite a long time. And state governments have been critical of the federal government for a while. They are now ready to actually invest themselves in starting to fill that role. Just earlier this year, the first policy that we would call very good, as opposed to just okay, in Australia, the New South Wales government has now committed some $600 million to things like electric vehicle rebates, charging infrastructure, their own fleet of vehicles, as well as a commitment to transition our full fleet of 8,000 buses in New South Wales to electric by 2030. So that's not new sales, that is the entire fleet being electric by 2030. And now, based on the market response to that, seeing whether or not they can bring that forward or set themselves a 95% target for earlier years, leaving a few that are already under contract for the intervening period. So you can see there what we do each year, and we're about to actually start doing twice a year, is provide a scorecard to governments about how they are behaving. And of course, this is a quite fluid scorecard, both based on what it is that states do and the federal government does, but also recognising that what some of these states who were doing the exact same thing 2 years ago now have a lower score because the need for ambition continues to increase. So we've seen steadily in Australia, particularly when we look at state governments having moved from no electric vehicle plans to electric vehicle strategies that recognise the need for some type of work to occur, to some small investments in things like charging infrastructure and their own fleet of vehicles, to now much more ambitious ones that include in thousands of dollars worth of rebates, 100% fleets targets, as opposed to just purchasing some vehicles for their own fleets, and really providing a more holistic plan for charging throughout their state to ensure that no one's left behind. Moving on, a little bit of work here. I won't speak too much to it, but just to show how fairly consistently the presence of electric vehicles exists pretty consistently. For those of you who don't know Australia too well, most people live in New South Wales, Victoria, and then less so Queensland, with those first two states accounting for about 66% of our market, everybody else together accounting for the rest. The ACT, our Australian Capital Territory, the one who most closely resembles New Zealand for us, a very progressive government there, but also by far our smallest jurisdiction, always most ambitious on things that have to do with clean energy, whether renewable energy or electric vehicles, and as a result, performing at the highest level at the moment. Again, as I mentioned, the number of models that are coming, that really the two things that I want to keep harping on about, based on 12 months ago today, I mentioned here, we've seen a 50% increase in the number of electric vehicle models, and that's what you're seeing there in the green. But then also, much like with sales, much like with infrastructure, it's not just that there is growth, but that growth continues to accelerate. So again, if we look at models pegged to come here by the end of 2022, or at least an intention to come here by the end of 2022, we're not just looking at another 50% increase. I think it's more like a 80% increase. And of course, we're about to update this in January. There'll be a lot more blue, a lot more in the blue column here, because of course, the plans continue to come forward, and we're seeing the number of new models being brought to our market or slated to come to our market in a short period of time continue to ramp up. And much like New Zealand, I would say, we look a lot at model availability, not just on variety, but also on volume, because I think much like your market, getting supply is is a much larger part of our problem than demand. And I'll get into that in just a moment as well. I mentioned there a bit about the number of chargers built. You can see here we've broken that up by per year based on both level 2 as well as fast charging. I should have probably broken out fast charging by itself. It sort of gets gobbled up a little bit in this graph, but as you can see, that total number continued to grow year on year. Yes, and there's the part that I wanted to get into. So each year what we do is we do a survey of consumers and their sentiment around electric vehicles, both purchase sentiment as well as use and just general policy attitudes. We use this, particularly on the policy attitudes, we actually do that a bit more often than once a year, but we use this for a range of things around informing the work that we do, as well as our policy advocacy work to governments as well. And I think, as I mentioned, so much of our work and the work that we do in policy is to help increase the supply of electric vehicles, because for the past 5 years while we've been doing this work, what we consistently find is that somewhere above 50% of people would like their next vehicle to be an electric one, as long as the right parameters are met, as long as the suitable one's available to them in the right price, they're confident enough with charging. This is really just a question of, all else being equal, do you like the idea of an electric vehicle rather than are you actually going to buy one right away? And so that's what we find. Yes, the sort of that excitement and enthusiasm for the new technology is certainly there. I want to harp on about this a bit because we've obviously, with a market that's been until recently less than 1% of sales, consistently finding that more than half of people would like to purchase an electric vehicle. We actually stress test this quite a lot. We find different ways of asking this question, repeatedly asking this question in different ways in the same survey, asking different people, changing the people who do the survey work for us, changing methodologies for it, really to see whether or not this does stack up. And each time we find that number pretty consistently stays at around 55% of people. This time I think it's in total, it turns out to be about 54% of people here saying that they would already own an electric vehicle. And then, in fact, when we dive further into people who have spent more time researching electric vehicles, acknowledging there's a bit of self-selection there. If you're researching electric vehicles, it's probably because you want one. That number then skyrockets up to 75% of people or 80% of people. And while you can account for a bit of self-selection there in that the other main factors that we find is that need for greater education about the benefits of electric vehicles and how they work, often outdated views around the range or mileage, the sort of power and performance of vehicles and the number of charges available or charging times or even charging behaviors and patterns of where will I charge. As people spend more time looking into the realities of the technology, we find that their tendency to buy only increases. And what's been, again, reassuring for us is that number of, for a while there, the highest portion of responses would often be in the I don't know section of people who haven't spent any time researching in the first place and were giving us a general vibe as to electric vehicles seem like the new thing, so therefore I like it just because they are the new thing, to people who are saying we've heard enough about it now that I feel like I know enough about electric vehicles and I like them. So that continued to solidify for us. Again, we look into, and I would imagine because when I see these type of surveys internationally, I find our responses are pretty consistent. So nothing particularly special there about the Australian consumer. So I would imagine a lot of this holds up to the New Zealand consumer as well. With the benefits, the main benefits recognised for ownership of an electric vehicle are really around, by far and away, the running and maintenance cost savings of purchasing an electric vehicle. I won't read all of those for you, but again, there's an area that we've consistently found. There are two types of questions that we ask. One is, what do you think are the main benefits of electric vehicles as an abstract product, for broader socioeconomic reasons? And by far, we repeatedly hear that environmental concerns are the top reason for supporting electric vehicles. This question is much more as somebody looking to own an electric vehicle and drive one yourself, what actually encourages you about the technology? So putting away those sort of broader idealistic reasons, what else encourages you? And what we, again, consistently find is that running costs feature right up at the top of the list. Safety, of course, does as well. Interestingly, in another work, what we find is while safety ranks very highly, it's often seen as more of a hygiene factor of they need to be safe, and we like that they are safe. And it's great that in some respects they're safer than internal combustion engine vehicles, or they have more safety features than internal combustion engine vehicle equivalents. But that's not the deciding factor for us. That's more of you just have to have it in order to be in the game in the first place. So a few other things here of really looking at what it is that we need to achieve. And, I'll always give you a bit of a caveat of, as you know, when you ask consumers, they'll tell you one thing. And so you have to take it with a little bit of salt, but trying to find instances around what do we need to achieve in terms of price parity in order to get people buying electric vehicles. We'll, of course, particularly talking to fleets, spend a lot more time talking about total cost of ownership, but aware that for a private consumer, they're either not taking that into account because they don't do these type of calculations, or total cost of ownership over 5 years doesn't matter just because they're not liquid enough. They don't have the money up front to purchase a vehicle that's going to save the money in the longer term. So where is it that we need to reach? And so again, what we ask Australians here, and if people who are interested in different states, we can break it up into different states as well, is compared to a $40,000 internal combustion engine vehicle, how much would you be willing to pay in order to buy an electric vehicle? As you can see, only 8% of people tell us that they'd like to pay less for an electric vehicle than an equivalent petrol or diesel vehicle. 30%, by far the highest, say that they would just like it to be at price parity. But then also interestingly finding, yes, there are groups of consumers who are willing to pay more. I would say that the 60 and the 55% being 9 and 7% of responses are probably oversubscribed. I think there's probably a bit of people who are supportive of electric vehicles but wouldn't actually spend that much money. You could possibly half those numbers, but that willingness to pay slightly more, whether that's $5,000 or $10,000 more for an electric vehicle in order to realize those savings that we sort of mentioned were the top reason earlier, and this is an area that we are finding each year actually does continue to increase, are increasingly being recognized of yes, I can buy the car for more upfront, but then save money. Similarly, finding the responses to these echo a lot of not just hearing this in the electric vehicle in the automotive space, but just a better understanding of energy efficiency more broadly. So the types of responses that we hear, actually, some of them are certainly about cars, but quite often are also about, I get it, there are star rating systems for my fridge or my dishwasher or anything else. This is just the same as that. It's going to cost a bit more, but I'll save the money in the longer run. So it's worth paying a bit more upfront. Okay. I already mentioned this bit around we consistently find environmental concerns are the highest reason for support more broadly for electric vehicles. Interestingly, each year that we've asked, health has either been a very close number to, or is here sort of somewhere in the mix. So that's, and similarly, whether it's, we've just sort of went through bushfires and other things, so that the concern around public health and pollution sort of continues to evolve and continues to change. Let me just take a quick look at how long I've been speaking for, if that's okay.
I'm not on the VPN.
Nope, you've got another speaker. Look, I'll leave it on this one if that's okay. Again, that's us looking at our electricity system. We do consistently find that this is coupled for consumers with people who are also looking for clean energy products, whether that's solar and batteries already installed, or wanting to lump those together in buying solar and an electric vehicle at the same time to transition their household emissions. I'll stop there and I'll move over to questions. Thank you.
Yeah. And yeah, I've got no idea what an executive contract looks like.
Excellent. Thank you for that presentation, Beard. I've got a couple of questions here that have been submitted, and then we can take any through the chat system as well. So these are in no particular order, but the first one's a charging question that you may have some feedback on. It goes, Australia has already seen a proliferation of multi-incompatible charging networks. Is the Australian EV Council taking a leadership role in bringing about interoperability so that Australians need not carry a multitude of either apps or RFIDs for charging?
So getting into incompatibility, I would say, actually even before the Electric Vehicle Council existed, we came around in late 2016, We did have an issue in terms of compatibility with plug types, that there was no standard, and so we had every either network or OEM sort of preferencing their own home country's plug type. That was something that we largely as an industry got together and resolved. So I guess those sort of physical constraints have been resolved, particularly when it comes to fast chargers, being built by the networks of companies. They are all OCPP compliant. So their capability to be networked and integrated with one another, that is something that we've worked on, and that's somewhere that we've reached. That next step for us as an industry is really ensuring that all of them offer a consistent option. So that may be if you're using the EV network, you do use the EV app or the EV RFID cards. But ensuring that every public fast charger at least also includes an FPOS payment option. And of course, very in line with Tritium, one of our major manufacturers here, keeping an eye on plug and play standards as well. So really looking at when we can move towards that at some point in the future. The opportunity to link in, so being able to use your app on any charger is probably the furthest away at the moment. It's certainly a discussion. The capability is there because the back end capability is there. At the moment, it's I'd say probably 3 major providers who have infrastructure in the ground today, a few more coming in, and will probably more likely to take a hub and spoke option rather than a centralized option in order for them to be able to sign deals with one another to use each other's network. But I would say where we have reached agreement on is that need to ensure that there is a common payment option like FPOS available at all of those chargers.
Right. Thank you. Understood. Also on that charging front, the question is, are there established national standards for home or domestic EV charging, i.e. wall boxes, 16 or 32 amp as an example, or is Australia just relying on the existing low amp plugs in garages? So are there any standards for domestic? In this country, we believe about 85 to 90% of charging is done domestically, therefore the importance of the question.
Yeah, we similarly find that most charging is done domestically. The only standards that are in place are just common electrical AC standards, not necessarily specific electric vehicle charger standards. There has been some question and discussion around implementing sort of smart standards, so protocols, communications protocol standards. Really, our push is much more of we're closely following and in discussions with the international body setting some of these, and we'd much rather they get set internationally and we adopt them rather than put them in place. There are, I would say, some states and some electricity network providers who would like to get them in as quickly as possible. We're still a little concerned that, particularly given we get our AC chargers entirely internationally, to make sure that we're being consistent with what's happening there. So more of a monitoring and watching the space rather than implementing anything right away.
Okay, thank you. Switch the questions now. Your interaction with OEMs on the vehicle supply side, have you got any insights for us in what's the mindset of the OEMs in Australia at the moment, their understanding of EVs, their ability to get supply? And if you could put a lens over that about operating in a Kiwi environment, if we're dealing with our head offices in Australia, what sort of angle do you think we should be taking to obviously use them as leverage and to gain a better understanding?
Yeah, look, I would say, and I would imagine a lot of this is similar, and I've certainly seen it change in the time from when I started speaking with, I didn't come from an automotive background in 2016, I come from an energy one, and having that discussion with OEMs and the heads of Australian OEM subsidiaries and seeing their sort of understanding of this evolve and their enthusiasm for this grow, I would say there's, like with New Zealand, there are people who are more excited about this and people who are going to be dragged kicking and screaming. Take a look at our membership list and you'll see which camp people fall into, essentially. And yeah, I think that understanding, I think from them certainly of a very similar issue around trying to get that allocation from head office being the biggest challenge. There being markets that absolutely have to be served because there are penalties in place, and without those penalties in place here, us missing out. So I mentioned what we've had even just throughout this year, much more recently, are rebates, but no state has moved or no government has moved to introduce a penalty system for not increasing. So we have no fuel efficiency standards in Australia, for instance. And so the stick is largely missing. So our discussion with OEMs is really based around, this is a great opportunity to demonstrate that you don't need the stick, just respond to the carrot, respond to the rebates and bring more vehicles here in order to meet that supply. That still is proving very difficult for a lot of people in their discussions globally the rebates are of course smaller than what are available in a lot of other markets like the EU and North America. And in those markets, there are both larger rebates and penalties. So things are still tipped towards their favor. And so that I would say the recognition for the need for those CO2 standards has ever been improved. We're at a point now where, a few years ago, if I dared talk about light vehicle CO2 standards, people would jump down my throat. Whereas now we have the CEOs of OEMs very publicly advocating for the need for them. Of course, they would like to be reasonable, and they'd have a lot of caveats inside of that. But they do very publicly say that without those, it is very difficult, near impossible for them to actually receive an allocation, certainly higher volumes of allocation of electric vehicles into our market. So we have seen some quite significant change, and I'd say probably one of the biggest influences of that is that every time we have been able to achieve some level of success, whether that's a bit more public support, new policy, car companies have found that as they have been able to convince their head office, get some more allocation, they have been successful. For instance, we recently got an allocation of only 400 of Hyundai's Ioniq 5s brought to the Australian market, and the pre-sales for that sold out within 2 hours, and that was with the website crashing, making it take a little bit longer. And so, as you can appreciate, they sort of OEM trying to work their way up the market share ladder within a market recognizes, well, if only I had more of those things, I could have really won this quarter. and my big problem here is getting enough of the products that consumers want, not in getting consumers to want to buy them.
Yeah. Good. Understood. Thank you. Let's switch to the electricity distribution topic. And the question is, how are Australian electricity distribution businesses preparing for the increase in domestic demand related to EVs? And is that approach uniform across Australia?
Well, I'd say certainly not. There's no sort of large, electricity networks are members of ours, or some of them at least are members of ours. And so their own enthusiasm for understanding this issue, being able to plan properly for it, investigating where they might be able to do more than plan and do their core business and actually expand out and diversify through their own regulated arms. Again, much like with OEMs, much like every other sector, there's a varying amount of, I think everybody is excited for electric vehicles because they're electricity companies at the end of the day, but how much they're doing about it probably varies. In terms of how well coordinated they are with one another, I would say probably a lot of appreciation for the fact that they should be better coordinated, but they are not better coordinated. They still are largely networks sort of running their own show. They do participate in common forums together to be able to share knowledge, skills and resources. But in our discussions, we have an electricity and infrastructure working group with a lot of network companies, for instance, and our message there repeatedly still is saying it's great that you all recognize electric vehicles and the changes they're going to bring about, but the amount of time and effort put into it from the company's perspective, it is a serious level of investment, but I would still say not as much as the huge size of the opportunity or change that's coming for the electricity sector yet. Some of that is, of course, reflective of the fact that while we are laggards and there's that uncertainty about when that is about to change and when it is going to ramp up, but I would sort of advise anyone that this is a good time to be prepared rather than allowing it to happen and then worrying about how quickly you can catch up.
Yep, good. On the charging front, one of your slides had up to 3,000 charge units by the end of this fiscal or calendar year, actually, including about 500 fast chargers. In your view, is that sufficient? And if it's not sufficient, what would you like to see in terms of the public fast charge network?
Look, I guess there's two questions there. One is a building for today versus building for tomorrow and what we want tomorrow to look like. I would say based on the amount of electric vehicles that we've got at the moment, and if we remain with incremental levels of growth, then yeah, sure, we've got, a need for a few like particular sites to have more chargers, but a handful or a few dozen more would be just fine. But of course, that's not what we want. What we want is large exponential growth coming around the corner. And based on that, we'd certainly like to see quite a lot more. We've tried to tackle that in a few different ways. One is we've set two ratios for Australia. And I'm testing my memory a bit here, but from memory, we've advised a ratio of 1 to 11, so 11 electric vehicles per public charger in areas with low off-street parking, and 1 to 19 or 1 to 20 in areas with high levels of off-street parking. The other way that we've gone about it is just geographic. So, for instance, if you take a look at the New South Wales government's electric vehicle strategy, you'll see some of this embedded, where among high urban areas, so sort of higher density suburban and urban areas and large commuter corridors, we've picked for a public fast charger to be made available within every 5 kilometre radius, and across regional areas for them to be made available initially at every 100 kilometre radius. I think that would need to come down to more like 75 kilometres. And then, in the future, every 25 kilometres and 5 kilometres as well. But in order to really give us that stable backbone of that confidence that, yes, there is charging everywhere we need it to be, I would say we're at a point where that does exist for the most popular places. So you can drive from Sydney to Brisbane or Sydney from across our capital cities, okay. But if you want to go inland, for instance, to other large regional towns, some of that is still missing. So it's really starting to plug a bit more of those gaps.
Good, thank you. A question about the fleets and the business communities. Can you comment about the Australian view or psyche around fleet adoption of EVs, or just pure business adoption of EVs? We've got a number of member organisations in that fleet and leasing market and in the large corporate space. What's the state of the play in Australia, and where do you think that's going?
Yeah, there's been a really interesting area and a sort of one where enthusiasm is certainly growing. We've, particularly in trying to target our policy recommendations, we of course have the top level, let's do everything for everyone policy recommendations, but then with the more pragmatic, given our government's ones are really much more focused at how we can help fleets transition. We actually have a free resource that we run here for fleet called Charge Together Fleets, for fleets to help build their business case around understanding electric vehicles, sort of what's required inside of it. It doesn't sell anyone anything, but it sort of helps give them a bit of education around transitioning their fleets. We did find in doing some of that work, we actually had to start, at square one rather than where we thought we'd start at square 10. We thought we'd be doing that program, sort of looking at very sophisticated purchase spreadsheets and trying to input things like energy costs and electric vehicle costs into their algorithms. This isn't for sort of FMOs. This is more for companies who own the fleets. And largely, we found actually what we needed to do was to provide them with the information about how to do a total cost of ownership calculation. Because they have been dealing with the one technology for so long, they were much like consumers, just very focused on upfront prices, and then thinking, well, everything else is basically the same. It's a petrol car or a petrol car. The price differences aren't going to be that varied. So it has taken a lot of education there in order to get them thinking more broadly about these things. I'd say charging is probably the area that's required the most amount of work. At the end, whether this is in heavy vehicles or light vehicles, it is still a vehicle at the end of the day, and the people that we're dealing with sort of know what vehicles are and they get it. They can sort of get their heads across electric vehicles reasonably quickly. Electricity infrastructure as well as charging. So this is not just the charger itself, but the infrastructure into their car park or their depot or whatever else it may be. That's usually where we get complete blank looks and where we've had to really have a much longer journey with these people around how to go about building capacity to allow for what type of charging you'll want to do in your sites. Next for us, and so we've got a large number of companies that have their own sustainability commitments around, achieving net zero or buying renewable energy, and we've got a quite large network of them. And particularly for us, we've sort of picked a few more iconic sort of brands to work with, and looking towards doing something similar with an electric vehicle commitment. So In New Zealand, you have members who have signed up to an EV 100 pledge, working through similar types of things, if not an EV 100 pledge itself, something similar to companies working out how they can transition their fleets across and make those commitments for future years to help provide that signal for companies to get more allocation of products here.
Great, good answer, thank you.
Dean, is it worth moving to some of the questions that are coming up on the chat as well?
Absolutely, moving to those as we speak. So, Beat, if you don't mind, we've got a couple of questions that have popped through, but they're good questions, so I'd like to give a little bit of time to those.
Sure.
The first question there is, has there been any work done in the area of commercial EVs? So commercial vehicles are very key to our population, and I know the Australian population as well, but a very slow one in terms of product release. Any comments in that area, commercial EVs, including trucks?
Yeah, so for things like vans and light trucks, certainly we have a partnership here with another peak body called the Australian Trucking Association, or exactly these things, and they're really looking at their customers and sort of logistics companies, and their big feedback to us was please focus on last mile vans and light trucks, leave heavy trucks for now. Our priority as the Electric Vehicle Council is always on deployment, so we don't do too much on what's the technology coming around, like we do personally, but as an organization, don't do too much on, how's the technology evolving, what's coming around the corner, what comes next, more on what is there already and why aren't they on our roads? How do we fix that point? And I think what was really encouraging, and again, very different from a few years ago, was, when we tried this quite a few years ago, a lot of those companies told us, well, yeah, we've heard about electric trucks, we've heard about electric vans, we'll think about them, give us 5 or 10 years to have a good think about what we might want to do. This time around, when we engaged with them, it was we want them here, how do we get them here? How do we start, yes, we have these questions about infrastructure, help us learn, help us start doing it. And as I mentioned, please focus on light trucks and vans so that we can focus on the things that we can do right now. So that really is how do we get, we've now got the eCanter here and a couple of other things. It's really looking at how can we just get more models for us to pick from so that we can buy them and start putting it into our fleets. That's been a mix of Australian companies wanting to hurry up and move, but certainly also finding that it's now being built into requirements, particularly from a few global companies who have global requirements around electrification. But then, I guess them reading the tea leaves of recognizing that more of their customers are going to be asking for this. So it's been interesting. It's been an area that's sort of very quickly moved from companies who would talk about this issue because we would go knock on their doors and hassle them and harangue them to talk about electric vehicles, to them very actively reaching out to us saying, our customers are demanding it of us now. So, you were right. I wish we did this 2 years ago when you were hassling us, but let's go and let's start working on this.
Yeah, good. Thank you. Understood. We can flick back to another question here. We've got, you mentioned current accessibility to charging is around about 15%, which appears to be quite low. Is that a real or perceived issue? And how can it be mitigated in your opinion, i.e. better signage, marking of charges, identification, etc.? So it's a question about the accessibility of charging at around about that 15% level.
Sorry, from memory, I think what that was referring to was I was saying we similarly find that charging does still occur around 85% at home, so the rest being public charging. And what I would say is this is entirely consistent with New Zealand and everywhere else in the world. We sort of came into this eyes wide open of sentiment of the importance of public charging is much, much higher than utilization of public charging. But sentiment is very important because consumers are buying based on sentiment, so you can't just ignore it and say that it doesn't exist. So yeah, I think that wasn't a comment about how accessible electric vehicle charging is. The other interesting point that we find, and I think this goes back to that question around how many standards we built into the home charger, we are still finding it's probably something like 70 or 80% now. There's an area that's much harder to get very tight statistics on. It's not recorded anywhere. It's more sort of anecdotal feedback from industry. Something like 70 to 80% of people aren't even installing an AC charger in their homes. They're plugging into a regular wall socket. Quite often, I certainly know that I do have a an AC charger in my home before anyone grabs me about it, but quite often finding people who started with the intention of getting one built because, of course, they came into their electric vehicle experience very worried about charging times and expecting they needed the fastest charge possible and concerned about where there are 350 kilowatt chargers, the fastest charger getting three-phase in their own home. But while they were waiting for the electrician for a few weeks, they just started using the wall socket, and that was all they did. And before too long, recognizing actually that was fine. They don't need anything else. Charging speed is not a concern at all. You can't charge slow enough as far as I'm concerned, given how long your car sits there doing nothing.
Yep, cool, understood. Different topic, this particular question. It's around the used vehicle market and the changes in the Australian laws allowing some environmental vehicles, I think is the class, imported in. Has that importation law change made a difference in people's perceptions of used vehicles? And has the used vehicle EV market played a significant change in the uptake of EVs in Australia?
I would say, please don't take this away, but I wouldn't say significantly. I would say we've seen some really great work happening by, there are a few companies who have set up, and there are community bulk purchasing programs, particularly with the Nissan Leaf and a few others, using that program in order to help get used vehicles here. I would say it's largely still something that we hear most about in whether it's sort of the enthusiast sort of market for electric vehicles. So people doing good business, I think you can make good money out of it, but still looking at dozens of imports rather than making a significant change to the way that if I sort of look at the number of new versus used vehicles in New Zealand versus what the Australian market looks like, the landscape hasn't changed as a result.
Gotcha, thank you. Question here just regarding one of the programs that New South Wales recently put in regarding the buses being bought in and the transition to fully electric buses. Do you see that type of spearhead action, if you call it that, being significant in Australia? And do you believe there are other examples that are a good level of profile that would be in similar magnitude to that transition?
Yeah, look, I'll harp on about this for a while because it's such a great example of so many things. We spent a lot of time telling state governments the first one of you that makes a very big commitment is going to land a bunch of jobs in getting electric buses manufactured. And New South Wales were exactly that. They went first. They said it's going to be 100% of our fleet, and now they have electric buses manufactured inside of their state. They were first place to get that, and every other state is left scrambling, saying, well, we have a few bus manufacturers. Can we get them to go start building electric ones? We're missing out here. And, we're not seeing them invest further in increasing their facilities because they're also recognizing that, electric's going to come and take their market share. So that benefit of moving first and moving early has certainly been well recognized. The other really big lesson here, though, is, and again, I'd like to take credit for this because I spent a few years saying this to our transport minister, but what really convinced him was hearing about it from transport ministers in London and Europe, which was that in the development of their electric bus plan, whatever, it wasn't sort of clear that it was going to be 100% as ambitious as it was. They, of course, heard from a whole range of stakeholders, OEMs, transit operators, certainly from their own department, I would say first and foremost, that it's too hard, that we need an extra 5 years, an extra 10 years to see how the technology rolls out, to investigate this a bit further. There are 1,000 obstacles, each of which are presented as deal breakers, as we can't potentially work out how to solve these things. And the big lesson that I'd say our minister came away with from the European trip was to come and say, no, it's happening around the world. We're setting the target. You have to do it. If you don't do it, guess what? You're going to miss out on contracts. It's not optional anymore. It's a mandate, because we did have states who made it optional, and they found that people weren't bidding for electric bus contracts. They were maybe bidding for one electric bus. Once that optionality went away, guess what happened to all of those 1,000 deal-breaking barriers? They all disappeared as well. So, well, of course, we can work out how to solve this problem. It's just that for the same amount of money, we could not do that work. And that's what we were choosing to do for a very long time. Yes, there are challenges. Yes, it's not an easy thing to do, but we can work out how to do it. And again, in seeing that evidence, I think has been really useful now for what we've been able to do with every other state. Not all of them have taken it up, but all of them are certainly now have their eyes on that number is 100%. It's no longer
Right.
Can we buy 20 more buses anymore? It's how quickly can we transition the entire fleet over?
Great, thank you. We've got time for just 2 more questions, so let me get into those, and otherwise we'll be running over time. A question just regarding domestic charging. Are you seeing any connection between solar installations and domestic charging, given the way that Australia generates your electricity?
Yeah, I think, and we talk about this a lot with, so a portion of the work that we do, while we get a lot of attention for our policy advocacy, is actually helping the industry come up with neat products and solutions and sort of research and other things. And there is a very, very high correlation of either people who already have solar and their willingness or interest in buying electric vehicles, or for people in a position to do so, looking to do both at the same time. So whether it's the solar panel driving them to want to drive an electric vehicle, or an electric vehicle, usually solar's been in their minds for a while, but in buying that electric vehicle saying, well, I should also pull the trigger on solar panels and other things as well. Certainly for, at the very least, buying green energy from the retailer, but in Australia, much more prevalently, in people finally building solar panels too. So I'd say, yes, there are also there companies then looking at who can we provide a joint deal with, essentially, right? And it's why you are seeing groups like electricity retailers doing things like, provide AGL here, for instance, does a electric vehicle car subscription program. Origin Energy does a fleet leasing program. And that is all sitting within that customer will be buying a few more things from us. How can we capture that customer in the first case in order to be able to lump a few more of these products together?
Great, thank you. Last question here we've got. When do you expect to see distance or road user-based charging coming into place in Australia for EVs? So that's road distance or road user-based charging.
Yeah, look, so some of our state governments, I was at, one of them in Victoria, we were very heavily critical of them, has already put them in place. And so, as I say, we're sort of provided quite a lot of opposition to that, but that's in effect now in one of our states. A lot of other states have signaled that they will introduce them with a delay, by either 2027 or by 2030. And all of the others, very similarly looking at, they're trying to peg those dates to certain levels of uptake. So how can we help our market achieve something more like 30% electric vehicle sales before we start introducing new chargers?
Great, thank you. Well, I think we should be leaving it there. We're about 5 minutes over time. I'd just like to thank you on behalf of the Drive Electric Board and our member base who's joined us today. Thank you for your insight into the Australian EV market. It looks like we've got plenty of work to carry on with. So on behalf of our group, thank you very much. And to our members who have joined us from our board and myself, thank you very much for attending. It's something we're trying to do for the membership base, is to encourage and educate, and this is part of that focus. So thank you to you all. And if you have any future questions, come back through to Hannah and we'll make sure that BR gets those and can reply to you. Once again, thank you for your time.